Genesis 14 is where we're going to be this morning. Hey, let me know how that goes, Michael. We've been trying to get him out for 40 years. Nothing has worked yet. He keeps coming back.
I've been hanging around with her for 48 years. I still don't have her trained.
He's not quitting while he's ahead.
I got to start Sunday school, so I'm going to have to leave that. I'm just going to have to leave that. Good to have you here. Let's pray. Genesis 14 is our portion this morning. Father, we thank you for your faithfulness to us, and we thank you for raising up faithful people who are examples to us of godly living in a sinful world. And so we pray your blessing upon our time. We ask your help. We ask always, Father, I ask always that I would teach the Scriptures correctly and clearly, and pray your help to that end in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, we're continuing along in our Sunday school series on Bible characters, and we're continuing on with Abraham, a man who merits sufficient or in-depth study of his life. And chapter 14 is, I would argue, a demonstration of his faithfulness to God in certainly a rather dramatic fashion. And there's a lot of, if I could put it this way, a lot of theological drama in the life of Abraham, because he becomes such an important character for us as an anchor point with reference to our own Christianity and our own conversion. And so the story itself, Genesis 14 itself, is a very dramatic chapter. It is filled with thrilling pieces of information. It is also, and I'll make note of this, and I'm sure that you're aware of it, it is filled with the kind of things that would capture the attention of the unbelieving world. Particularly the first 16 verses are the kind of thing that mainstream media would speak often and much about. And yet they are just simply preparatory for what becomes the major event in the chapter. Let's begin by reading verses 1 through 11. It came to pass in the days of Amraphel, king of Shinar, Arioch, king of Elasar, Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, and Tidal, king of nations, that these made war with Bera, king of Sodom, and with Bersha, king of Gomorrah, Shinab, king of Admah, Shemeber, king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, which is Zoar. All these were joined together in the vale of Siddim, which is the Salt Sea. 12 years they served Chedorlaomer, and in the 13th year they rebelled. And in the 14th year came Chedorlaomer and the kings that were with him, and smote the Rephaims in Ashtaroth Karnaim, and the Zuzims in Ham, and the Emims in Shaveh Kiriathim, and the Horites in the Mount Seir unto El Paran, which is by the wilderness. And they returned and came to En-Mishpat, which is Kadesh, and smote all the country of the Amalekites, and also the Amorites that dwell in Hazezon Tamar. And there went up the king of Sodom, and the king of Gomorrah, and the king of Admah, and the king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, the same is Zoar, and they joined battle with them in the vale of Siddim, with Chedorlaomer the king of Elam, and with Tidal king of nations, and Amraphel king of Shinar, and Arioch king of Elasar, 4 kings with 5. And the vale of Siddim was full of slime pits, and the kings of Sodom and of Gomorrah fled, and fell there, and they that remained fled to the mountain. And they took all the goods of Sodom and Gomorrah and all their victuals, and went their way. So the story that we have in verse number 11 is really, or verses 1 through 11, is a very old account, and I will point out why it is an old account, even by Moses' standards. And right, we understand Moses is writing the book of Genesis under the inspiration of the Spirit. And it's an old event even to Moses. So Moses is writing about something that is historical to him. And again, I think I can explain. I can explain why I think that that's what's going on in a minute. These are guys that we would consider to be noteworthy in their generation. These are the men who function like the President of the United States and the Prime Minister of Canada and the Premier of China and Mr. Putin of Russia. These are the kind of people whom the world takes note and who capture the attention of the media. We have 4 kings from the area of Babylon and the land of Shinar there. Verse number 1, Amraphel, king of Shinar. Shinar is generally considered to be the land of Babylon. The word is actually translated in Joshua 7:21 with Babylonish. Daniel 1:1, and you don't need to turn to it. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, came Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, unto Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, with part of the vessels of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar, to the house of his God. And he brought the vessels into the treasure house of his God. So we are essentially talking about the region that we will come to know as Babylon. Elsasser and Elam are also areas in that land. Isaiah 11:11, it shall come to pass in that day that the Lord shall set his hand again the second time to recover the remnant of his people, which shall be left from Assyria and from Egypt and from Pathros and from Cush and from Elam and from Shinar and from Hamath and from the islands or the coasts of the sea. So basically we have Babylon, not yet the empire that we know, but the land area that we recognize, makes war with 5 kings in the land where Abraham lived. And so these men are at least at some level and at some time waging a war not over the conquest of territory, but they are waging a war in the land that God had promised to him. And one of the reasons that I mentioned that it is old even by Moses' day is that Moses renames a number of the places. And not under the authority of I want to change the name, but of updating them, kind of as the map would update, right? For instance, at the end of verse number 2, the king of Bela, which is Zoar. Right? Bela was an old name when Moses was writing. Everybody knew it as Zoar. The same thing in verse number 3. All these were joined together in the Vale of Siddim, which is the Salt Sea. And there's one other place where Moses kind of updates the information for us. So Moses is writing about something, again, we know that happened very old by his standards. And he's kind of providing a little bit of a modernization for his readers and for those of us who follows. In verse number 4, you have the reason why we have this global conflict. 12 years they served Chedorlaomer, and in the 13th year they rebelled. And they served him by paying tribute money to him. This was the common way of dealing with these kinds of things. Again, there were occasionally wars of land conquest. The Israelites were going to wage one of these days and take this land for themselves. But very often the king and his army would come in, they would conquer the people, subjugate them, and then they would extract tribute from them, set up a puppet governor or get allegiance from the local governor. And so this had happened, and it happened for 12 years. And in the 13th year, this 5-year coalition of kings evidently decided enough is enough. We have no idea what was going on in the world economically or politically that they felt this was the time to rebel. They just did. Because again, right, this is kind of the framework for the story, but it is not the story. We're not just reading the military history of the Babylonian people. 2 years later then, verses 5 through 11, In the 14th year came Chedorlaomer and the kings that were with him. And so they have come to extract their vengeance and to reinstitute the tribute money. And they are wildly successful. They are just unstoppable almost, victorious every place they go. They work their way down, and if we were looking at maps, we would be able to see kind of the southern trajectory. And then in verse number 7, they turned back because there was evidently some people that they wanted to get that they didn't get the first time. And they returned and came to En-Mishpat, which is Kadesh. Again, see another renaming of a place, updating the GPS coordinates, so to speak, and smote all the country, the Amalekites, and also the Amorites that dwell in Hazezon Tamar, which if you're thinking, right, because, right, we know one of the reasons we know that it's being updated, folks, is because some of these people do not yet exist biblically at the time of this event. These names are Moses' names. They are not the names that Abraham would have used. And finally then in verses 8 through 11, they reach their primary objective. Right? So I mean, again, not the main part of the story, but if you just think of it from a strategy standpoint, they come down and they wage a war against anybody who might be able to help their main adversary. And finally in verses 8 through 11, there went out the king of Sodom. Right? This is the guy who has been the main instigator in the rebellion. There went out the king of Sodom, the king of Gomorrah, the king of Admah, the king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela. Again, another update, the same as Zoar. And they joined battle with them in the Vale of Siddim. And we do need to talk a little bit about this. Verse number 10, the Vale of Siddim was full of slime pits, and the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled and fell there, and they that remained fled to the mountain. Right? So there are just a couple of notes. Number one, this is a reference not simply to the kings themselves, but to their armies. And the word fall there does not mean that the king of Sodom died there, because we know that the king of Sodom isn't dead. One of the ways that the word fell can be translated is to go into hiding, which really seems to be the primary thrust of the text. Right? These men go down into the slime pits and hide themselves in this. I don't know if any of you saw the recent series of documentaries Ken Burns produced on the American Revolution, but in one of the episodes they talked about one of the American generals who was known as the Swamp Fox, who was so successful at hiding his army in the swamp, a swamp in the south, that the British never could find him. So they went and they fell down. Not that everybody died there. That's not the point that the text is making. So again, all of this, folks, through verses 1 through 11 are just preparatory. They are essential preparatory information, but they are not the main point of what is going on. This isn't simply a lesson in world history. In verses 12 through 16, then, we are finally beginning to be informed or directed to why this matters to us. Verse number 12, and they took Lot, Abram's brother's son, who dwelt in Sodom, and his goods, and departed. And there came one that had escaped and told Abram the Hebrew, for he dwelt in the plain of Mamre the Amorite, brother of Eshcol, and the brother of Aner, and these were confederate with Abram. And when Abram heard that his brother was taken captive, he armed his trained servants, born in his own house, 318, and pursued them unto Dan, which is to the very far north of what will become the land of Israel. And verse 15, he divided himself against them, he and his servants by night, and smote them, and pursued them unto Hobah, which is on the left hand of Damascus, which is in Syria, outside of Israeli land. And he brought back all the goods, and also brought again his brother Lot and his goods, and the women also, and the people. Right? So whatever, by the way, whatever the four kings were doing on their excursion down from the north Babylon, down into the south, into the land of Palestine, the Israeli land, Abram did the same to them. The word smote, same word smote is used in 14:5, 14:15, 14:7, and 14:17. They smote them. There was a battle. It wasn't an extermination. Not everybody died, but there was a decisive conquest. And Abraham recovered Lot. Now later, in chapter 15, we will learn that this did not happen simply naturally. In other words, if you ask the question, how could 318 men wage a successful military engagement against an army that had been unstoppable to this point and come out successful? The answer is God. The answer is God. And God was certainly involved in this battle, which again would kind of raise the question, why does God get involved at this point in the battle? I mean, I think we know the answer, right? But God has been pretty much hands off up to verse number 12, and now God is involved. Although the text does not tell us that. Again, it is revealed in Genesis chapter 15. But this still is not, folks, the point of the story. The recovery of Lot and the deliverance of Lot's goods and recovering of Lot and his goods are not the main story. It's a thrilling part of the story. Again, if we were looking at it a little bit through the eyes of a media viewer and a media presenter, right? The headline might be the invasion of 4 kings against 5. And the conclusion of the broadcast, the feel-good part of the story, might be the way that one man rallied to the cause of a relative and brought about his rescue. But we still haven't reached the main point of the story. All of this is going somewhere, and all of these geopolitical, all of these military, all of these economic considerations, folks, are ultimately developed to reveal spiritual truth. And so finally we get to the main event, verses 17 through 24. And the king of Sodom went out to meet him after his return from the slaughter of Chedorlaomer, and of the kings that were with him at the valley of Shaveh, which is the king's dale. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought forth bread and wine, and he was the priest of the Most High God. And he blessed him and said, Blessed be Abram of the Most High God, possessor of heaven and earth. And blessed be the Most High God, which hath delivered thine enemies into thy hand. And he gave him tithes of all. And the king of Sodom said unto Abram, Give me the persons, and take the goods to thyself. And Abram said to the king of Sodom, I have lifted up my hand unto the Lord, the Most High God, the possessor of heaven and earth, that I will not take from a thread even to a shoe latchet, and that I will not take anything that is thine, lest thou shouldest say, I have made Abram rich, save only that which the young men have eaten, and the portion of the men which went with me, Honor, Eshcol, and Mamre, let them take their portion. So this is really the main event. The king of Sodom has cleaned himself up after running to the slime pit. The smoke of battle has cleared. The Babylonians have returned to their homes. And now we have this conference. Abram is met by 2 kings. We've had 9 kings being discussed in the battle. 4 kings against 5. The text has been very clear to point that out to us. But now we are reduced to 2 kings. In verse number 17, the king of Sodom. And in verses 18 through 20, the king of Salem. Now there is no doubt, folks, that the king of Salem, this man Melchizedek, is unbelievably important in the biblical narrative. And I want to take just a moment, right, I think we have the time this morning. We encounter Melchizedek in essentially three passages in the Bible. The first one is Genesis 14. Of course, one of the things that we're inclined to do is have a discussion about whether Melchizedek is a real man, real human, or whether he is an Old Testament appearance of Christ. I personally think that Melchizedek is a real man, but if we understand his purpose, we need not fight over his identity, if I could put it that way. The second is in Psalm 110, which is roughly 1,000 years or so after the Genesis account. And then he's mentioned in the book of Hebrews, where all of the pieces are tied together. And one of the things that I take note of, okay, if I can just take a second and take a moment with a little bit of pastoral testimony, is that the pastor in the book of Hebrews is frustrated that his primarily Jewish congregation, or his primarily Jewish audience, is not fully prepared to understand the proper role of Melchizedek. And so there has to be sort of a pause so that this man can develop, to our benefit and blessing, the proper place of Melchizedek in the biblical narrative. All of which, again, to go back to the pastoral testimony, when occasionally there will come some lament or even at times criticism or question, must we always just spend our times working through the Bible? The answer is yes. That's the task of the pastoral ministry. And if you go to Hebrews chapter 5, the pastor says, I got a lot of things to talk about, but you don't understand them yet. And so now we got to go back and we got to recover the information about Melchizedek. And Melchizedek's priesthood functions to place Christ's priesthood completely outside in probably a dozen ways, superior to and independent of the Levitical priesthood, which every Jew was slavishly devoted to. So there is the significance of Melchizedek in a moment biblically. But our attention this morning is primarily upon Abraham, so I want to return our attention to him. In verse number 21, Sodom, the king of Sodom, kind of makes a demand of Abraham. The king of Sodom said to Abram, give me the persons and take the goods to thyself. And the people, right, goes back to verse number 16. He brought back all the goods and also brought again his brother Lot and his goods and the women also and the people. So you can see in your mind's eye this kind of setting wherever it is, right? Verse number 17, they meet in the valley of Shaveh, the Kingsdale, and here is the king of Sodom and probably the other kings. Here is the king of Melchizedek. Here is Abraham, here is Lot, and here's all the people, and here's a mound of stuff, or maybe wagon loads of stuff that are being carted back that have been taken by the four-king Babylonian army. And the king of Sodom says to Abram, just let me have the people, and you can keep the stuff. Let me have the people back. They're people of my kingdom. Let me have them back, and then all the stuff belongs to you. What is noteworthy, folks, of all the story, what I would suggest to you is where the story is ultimately going, is verse number 20. Here's Melchizedek talking. Verse 19, Melchizedek blessed him and said, blessed be Abram of the Most High God, possessor of heaven and earth. Blessed be the Most High God, which hath delivered thine enemies into thine hand. And there's your first notice, by the way, that this is divine assistance, not just superior military strategy. And he gave him tithes of all. So here comes this man, and he's always a mystery man, folks, right? I mean, Melchizedek, right? The pastor in Hebrews says, without father, without mother, without beginning, without end, right? He's just there. He shows up. Where did he come from? We don't know. Where did he go? We don't know. What about him? We don't know anything about him. He's just there. This brief moment, he comes, he blesses Abraham, and what does Abraham do? Here's the mound of stuff that they have recovered. And Abraham gives a tithe of that to Melchizedek, which the pastor in Hebrews uses to point out the superiority of Melchizedek. Right? One of the right giving and tithing is not the main subject matter, but the point of any financial giving, folks, is to recognize the superiority of the one that you're giving to. It is an offering. I offer it to you because you are my superior. That is the point, and that is what Abram does. But he completely, to go back to Abraham, but he completely rejected Sodom. Verse 22 through 24, and Abram said to the king of Sodom, I have lifted up my hand unto the Lord, the Most High God, the possessor of heaven and earth, that I will not take from a thread to a shoe latchet, that I will not take anything that is thine, lest thou shouldest say, I have made Abram rich. So he gave to Melchizedek, and he refused to take from Sodom. Wanted nothing from Sodom, wanted no affiliation with Sodom, wanted no connection to Sodom, wanted no taint of Sodom. Don't want to be identified with you. Don't want anybody to say that you have enriched me. So how do we conclude this? Well, let me just make a couple of observations, comments about Abraham's activity here. Number one, he continues to manifest a trust in the promise of Genesis 13, 14 through 17, in which God promised him the land. I personally think that it is very significant that in all of the conflict that was going on here, Abraham made not one protest that people were fighting in his land or over his land. He goes to war over Lot, but not over land. Secondly, Abram is surrounded by people who have no allegiance to Jehovah. But that does not stop him from being loyal to Jehovah. It's always nice, folks, to have allies in our faith, but they are not necessary for our faith. Thirdly, surrounded by people who are consumed with power and what it can provide for them, Abraham is not consumed with power and what it can provide for him. He will not enrich himself at Sodom. Fourthly, think of what a testimony this should have been to Lot. The text never develops it. Again, it isn't until Peter reminds us that Lot is a believing man that we would ever come to that conclusion on our own. But Lot is locked hand in hand with Sodom and Gomorrah. He loves Sodom and Gomorrah. There's never an accusation that he participated in their degrading practices, but he lived there, he governed there, and his family very much loved it there. Abraham, by contrast, didn't want anything to do with it. Not even a wayward thread did Abram want from Sodom. Which means, fifthly, folks, that Abraham is manifesting, again, in a very dramatic way, the biblical concept of holiness or consecration, the idea of being different. Abraham is different. He's not standing there going, look at me, how different I am. He's just living in a different dimension, so to speak. He is loyal to a different God. He is serving a different deity. He has focused his life around different things than everybody around him. He is a genuinely consecrated man. Okay, questions, comments, critiques? Ed, yes, sir.
When he goes out and says that he gives a tenth, Abram gives a tenth to Melchizedek, then so is he giving 90% back then to Bera, king of Sodom?
Well, part of the question is a tenth of what? And we don't really know whether right, because we kind of discuss, is it a tenth of the booty that he recovered, or is it a tenth of the personal wealth that he already had accumulated? I'm inclined to think that it was of the booty. Again, I don't want to say this is weird to us, but we don't really think this way. In that part of the world, you went to war as much for people and goods as you did for land. It wasn't about the conquest of land, right? I mean, it was like robbing somebody's house. You know, you didn't want their house, you wanted their television and their VCR or their, have I just revealed my age? Does anybody want a VCR, right? And we put them out in the front yard and go free to a good home. So it was about the stuff. So I think that he gave Melchizedek the tithe of that, but wanted no connection with Sodom. That would be my understanding of it. But again, there is kind of a discussion about that. What he actually gave. Not, the tenth is obvious, but a tenth of what? That's kind of what I think. Rick.
So, in essence, is what they got back, because he said, besides what Eshcol and
Yeah,
would get, so they took a portion of it.
they got their portion. So some of his companions got their portion. And then, of course, the guys had to eat, and I don't think anybody begrudged that. And nobody would view that. Abram just was very plain here, right? I don't want to be tainted with sodomite wealth. And Lot is up to his ears in sodomite wealth. I think there's a little bit of a comparison. Because, right, there are consecrated believers and there are worldly believers. And, right, we're always, in our world, we're trying to navigate, right, how to be a consecrated believer in a materialistic world is not always an easy thing. Who does he? John.
Well, your comment about not concerned about land, which kind of goes with it. He paid for Sarah's grave.
Yes.
So they were willing to give it free, and he could have taken it free. It was his land, or promised to be his land, but yet he was still willing to pay for it.
Yes. Well, so if you didn't catch that, he paid, and we'll get to that. I don't know that we'll deal with that extensively, but Abram does pay for Sarah's burial plot. Abram lives his life as a lifelong sojourner. We'll see in chapter 15 that when God reiterates the promise to Abraham of the land, he expands upon it by pointing out to them, I'm promising you the land, but it's going to be 400 years. Right? So it's your land to you and your seed, but you won't be here in 400 years. So, anything else? Paul?
Yeah, I think another aspect might be that they defeated these kids, and they were from Babylon, and they tended to bring all their junk with them. And so that was the booty that I think the king of Sodom, as the head of the confederation, was saying, hey, you can have all this stuff. And so I think there's an additional aspect, or I'm questioning if there's an additional aspect that Abram didn't want any of the stuff he'd left in Babylon either.
Well, that's a good point. Whatever they had conquered, taken away from the Babylonians, That was by the, well, how would you guys put it? By the rules of warfare, right? That belonged to the king, to the confederacy of the kings of Sodom.
So they gained a lot of stuff.
I think they gained a lot of stuff. And then, of course, the geopolitical side, again, because the Bible's not telling that story, right? You know, did these guys keep fighting? You know, did this come back? Did it end the thing? Well, you know, that's not the point of the story. Abram is the focus of the story. All right, so we'll be back then in 20 minutes.